So in the last lecture, we were discussing the sort of slow and belated mobilization of the United States towards action in the Second World War. The United States in the 1930s, when Nazi Germany pulled out of the League of Nations, pulled out of the various disarmament agreements that it had agreed to in the 1920s under the Weimar Republic, the world really watched as Nazi Germany militarized, as Nazi Germany passed the Nuremberg laws and began to persecute its Jewish populations and other different populations and political sort of dissidents within Germany. As all of that happened and the British and the French stood by, shocked, the United States really on the other side of the Atlantic, sort of stood aside and really had no interest in being meaningfully engaged in helping the British or the French. The United States in the late 1930s was pretty upset over the fact that its debts that were owed by the British and the French and other countries from World War I had not been repaid. The United States, many Americans saw the United States' role in the First World War as something that the United States should not have done, that they became entangled in a European conflict, that they had given a lot to help Europeans, the British and the French particularly, succeed, and then they had not been paid back from it, and it seemed like they had fought all of this conflict in 1917 and 1918 for nothing. And so in the 1930s, the United States passed a series of neutrality measures, and basically in 36, 37, 38, the United States had effectively asserted that it was not going to become involved in any kind of conflict or crisis in Europe. And it, as a result, refused to provide any sort of military support or to even mobilize itself for potential war. Even after the war began in 1939, President Franklin Roosevelt and Winston Churchill began secret meetings, and even then, it was some 2 years before the United States, under Roosevelt, who very much was sort of operating within the context of his time. Like he was an internationalist, but he could only do what sort of the voting populace in the United States would have liked him to have do within reason. And so the United States in 39 was really woefully unprepared for war. It had something in the way of one experimental tank. When the United States actually begins preparing for war, in some cases it has soldiers doing drills with broomsticks against milk trucks with Panzer for German tank division painted on the side. So the United States slowly began to mobilize, and it doesn't really, in a meaningful sense, get involved in helping the Allies until March of 1941, when it begins Lend-Lease. And Lend-Lease is a massive program, a $50 billion program. 20% of it went to the Soviet Union to defeat Nazi Germany and also the Japanese Empire. And the United States only began that because it was apparent that the Nazi conquest of Europe seemed likely if the United States did not step in. And so through his fireside chats, Franklin Delano Roosevelt really worked to encourage Americans to support its effort to help the British, the Allies, the Soviet Union ultimately after the invasion of the USSR by Nazi Germany in June of 1941. After the United States becomes engaged in the war, and of course, with the Japanese attack on December 7th, 1941 on Pearl Harbor, the United States really becomes involved in the war in earnest, fighting against declaring war in Japan, and Germany declaring war in the United States, and likewise the United States reciprocating. After that point, the basis really for the United States' effort in the war is really built on something called the Atlantic Charter. At home in the United States under FDR, very much building on sort of the notions of the New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt advocated what he called his four freedoms, that the United States was fighting for freedom. And here you see a famous poster by Norman Rockwell. There was several of these posters that were created by the artist Rockwell to sort of convey this unified effort on the part of Americans to come together in this effort. And I think if you look at the Second World War, you can really understand that it is an example of what a united America, the kind of profoundly impressive things that a united country, a united America can do when it comes together around important issues. The four freedoms, really at the heart of American civic ideas: freedom of speech, freedom from want, freedom from fear, and freedom of worship. Well, you could also call that freedom of thought. Coupled with the Atlantic Charter, World War II was a war to bring freedom and self-determination to the world. This was the ideal that Franklin Roosevelt, and that he really argued that the United States was fighting for: to end tyranny, to end imperial oppression and control of other peoples, and bring people their right to self-determination, and to bring them these four freedoms, not only at home in the United States, but abroad. As a result, the four freedoms very much motivated decolonization. So remember, the world before World War II, you're talking about European powers, the British, the French, and otherwise. Japan, of course, had created massive empires where they had colonized, and the United States was part of this too. It had colonies like the Philippines, but they had colonized the world. And this rhetoric that the United States is in this fight for freedom and self-determination, it really motivated independence movements, and that's what decolonization refers to. The independence movements across the world, across Africa, Southeast Asia, and other parts of the world. So after World War II, you will see a huge amount of attempts at independence or at more representative government across the developing world, in Vietnam, in Africa, in places like Algeria, in places like Malaysia, which was part of the British Empire, in the Americas, in places like Cuba, where while Cuba was not a colony, it had a non-representative government that was seen as repressing the people. In the United States, you had a robust civil rights movement that emerges, both for women and groups like African Americans, who really saw the war as something where they're fighting for freedom, but they don't have freedom at home. You have segregation in the United States. You have unequal treatment when it comes to pay and work. And so World War II becomes sort of, as a result of this rhetoric, really, becomes very much an umbrella for the women's rights movement, second wave feminism as it's sometimes called, the civil rights movement that would be carried through by African Americans who, during the conflict, of course, were forced to serve in a segregated armed forces, groups like the Tuskegee Airmen, for example. And after the war, of course, both groups, women and minorities like African Americans, they're going to have to resist a continued attempt by the sort of status quo in the country to revert to the unequal, unfair nature of the United States before the war. World War II sort of brings up, it's kind of in a lot of ways a watershed moment for a conversation that was very much related to, well, back to the progressive era, but also to the New Deal. And this is the conversation of capitalism, of the middle class, of employment, and people's right to security. So when one reads the Second Bill of Rights, which was given in Franklin Delano Roosevelt's State of the Union in 1944, Roosevelt's talking about effectively people having a right to living wage jobs, people having a right to housing, to education, to some form of health care, even a right to vacation time. He's talking about really taking the ideals of the New Deal to another level and saying that these are rights of Americans, that Americans have a right to security, they have a right to employment, to a reasonably paying job, a right to vacation, a right to health care, a right to education so that they can fulfill the American dream. In the latter stages of the Second World War, there were New Dealers, as you might call them. These were civil rights leaders, labor union leaders, religious leaders, who supported an act in Congress called the Full Employment Act. It doesn't pass, as you're probably not surprised, though some things come out of it. But the Full Employment Act was basically an idea that said that the government, very much, again, a New Deal sort of attitude here, that the government should take the responsibility that when the free market economy, the privatized sector of the economy, is unable to fully employ Americans, that the government would step in, a la the New Deal, the PWA, the WPA, the CCC. They would step in and provide government jobs that would sort of make up the slack to guarantee that all people had a job. All people that wanted to work would have a job, to basically guarantee more or less security and living wages for Americans. The Full Employment Act was something that was a really a big goal. But there was a conservative coalition in Congress, and they feared deficit spending. They feared inflation from this. There's a lot of pushback from private companies that did not want the United States government in the New Deal sort of mantra of the New Deal becoming more deeply involved in the private sector economy. And so the United States does do the GI Bill of Rights, which is still in place today, to help to house veterans coming home from World War II, to help fund their education, and to provide other incentives. But the Full Employment Act was intended to be for all Americans, and it doesn't succeed. And the fact that it doesn't succeed really sort of was a testament to a shift in the course and the direction of the United States when it comes to the role of the government in the economy and in the lives and business lives of Americans. Talk a little bit about a change in economics here. So there is sort of maybe laissez-faire is the wrong word, but laissez-faire refers to unregulated capitalism. But there is a conservative reaction to the era of the New Deal and to the sort of progressive era before it, that really reacts to the government involvement in the economy, and increasingly was pushing for increased privatization, increased sort of increased stock market and private sector emphasis, if you will, in the economy, as opposed to the government involvement in the economy. So here you see pictured really the father of what's called Austrian economics, Ferdinand Hayek. And Hayek, who is actually not a laissez-faire conservative, I should say, so he was not opposed to minimum wages. He was not opposed to some of the safety nets and things like Social Security, but he does believe that the New Deal was a level of planning, of government planning in the economy, that was not in the interest of the United States and of economic prosperity for nations. And so there's a pushback from the Keynesian economic approaches, right, of the New Deal. There's a pushback from that. Keynesian economics was deficit spending and government involvement in the economy through the New Deal. And during World War II, you have lots and lots of big companies who get huge contracts to build ships, to build tanks, to build the various weapons of war. And as a result of this, you see an increasing pushback from the government sort of involvement in the economy towards more of private sector economics, to reduce the government involvement in the economy and allow the capitalist system to sort of to play itself out in a less regulated way. So Hayek, again, he's not a fully laissez-faire conservative. He does promote safety nets and minimum wage policies, but his philosophy is ultimately used later by figures like Ayn Rand, who of course is the author of novels like The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, who became sort of a conservative icon because she promoted what was called ethical egoism, in which she argued that moral action was self-interested action, that individuals should pursue their own selfish and self-interested goals, and as long as it was rational, that was the moral approach. And so Ayn Rand very much became sort of a defender of an unregulated capitalist economy in which individuals would either survive or they would not. And she became an opponent of sort of regulation and these types of things, and very much as a result has become sort of a conservative sort of philosophical, almost like a symbol of conservative philosophy in the 21st century because of her staunch opposition to New Deal type programs and involvement in providing whether it's social safety nets or these types of programs to help social uplift, taxations, these types of things. So last slide in this section, I wanted to provide this little timeline to give us a big picture here. So here you see up top, you see Franklin Delano Roosevelt from New York State, very much the champion of New Deal liberalism, as it might be called, which was the idea, again, that the government can be used as a vehicle to improve the lives of all Americans, and that the government should be involved in the economy, it should be involved in these areas to ensure that Americans have really the promise of those four freedoms that really became the embodiment of the mission of the United States in the Second World War. And of course, here you see Ronald Reagan, whose election, and we'll be talking about this, Ronald Reagan, of course, becomes associated with the rise of what's called the new conservatism, in which increasingly a less regulated approach to the economy comes to embody sort of the overriding context of political thought in the United States, and that's 1981 to present. So a paradigm. Paradigms refer to the broader context, if you will, the broader structure, the basis where which decisions, the context of events occur, right? So political and economic paradigms in American history, if you go back to the Gilded Age, we know the Gilded Age from 1870 to 1900 is an era of really less government regulation. It's a hands-off approach by presidents that historians dubbed the forgettable presidents. It's an era in which the government and corporations sort of worked together to crush labor unions, and in which workers had very, very little in the way of rights or of any kind of benefits, whether guaranteed by a business or by the government. With the exception of the brief period of the 1920s, where we saw sort of a brief, decade-long sort of return to more Gilded Age approach, the era from 1901 to the end of the 1970s is the era of sort of what you might call New Deal liberalism. This is the age of the progressive era, New Deal liberalism, which is based on the idea of regulating a capitalist economy. As a result of this, it's associated with the legitimizing and growth of unions. It's associated with the creation of Social Security, of the minimum wage laws, which occurs after the Second World War when Harry Truman's president, of programs like Medicare to provide health insurance to those beyond retirement age, to Medicaid to provide health benefits for those individuals that are in a economic class that require it, unemployment benefits, programs like WIC, benefits for children, better pay for workers, better pay for the middle class, and also, though, all of this is funded with higher taxes on corporations and the richest Americans. So as a result, this period of time, you see more security and stability for working and middle-class Americans, but you see less sort of wealth at the top, less millionaires being born. The age of the new conservatism from 1981 to present, 1981 to the 21st century, is an age of less regulation. So this is an age where unions are generally increasingly challenged. Union membership goes down as you see the emergence of what are called right-to-work states. The economy becomes less regulated by the government. Taxes for the wealthiest people go down. Corporate taxes go down. And as a result, during this period of time, you had an explosion in the millionaire class. More millionaires were produced in this period of time than in any other period in American history, at least since the beginning of the 20th century. And so, as a result, you do have a growth in the inequality gap, but the economy is pretty strong during this period. You have a lot of millionaires born. There's a reduction in labor unions, and there are increasing austerity measures and or limitations on what you might call so-called welfare programs. Now, during this period of time, you start to see a return to the sort of boom-bust cycles of the earlier, less regulated periods. What I mean by a boom-bust cycle is you start to see periods of huge economic growth and then crashes in the economy. And so you had a number of these types of issues that sort of seem to reemerge in that period of time, the most significant of which being the Great Recession of 2008. But just to give us an example, an understanding, a broad picture here of these paradigms in American history and the context in which decisions are made, it's important to note that during this time period, even though many individuals might refer to Bill Clinton or Barack Obama as somehow liberals, in the context of New Deal liberalism, they're not really liberals. They're much more conservative. Their taxes on the wealthiest of corporations are much lower than not only this period of time, at least the period following the New Deal in the 1930s, they're lower than Ronald Reagan's even in most cases. So they're operating in the context of that political paradigm. And that's the paradigm we currently operate in.